Is the series going to be finished? Now, which series do you think I'm talking about? Because there's George R.R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire and Patrick Rothfuss' The Kingkiller Chronicle. This series has 2 of the 3 books, and it hasn't had a book in over 10 years, and it doesn't look like we're going to get a book anytime soon. That, along with some of Patrick's particularly sketchy choices, doesn't make it feel like we're going to get a book or even a chapter anytime soon, despite him saying otherwise. Now, I haven't really been able to find any information on this series for the last 3 years of any sort of publishing, and a lot of the Reddit posts that I've seen were of 2020, so 3 years ago is kind of the last update we had. But as of then, even his editor hadn't even seen a full book, let alone a chapter from it, and they thought that Patrick hadn't written in 6 years. So that is what we're going to be discussing today. Is the Kingkiller Chronicles ever going to be finished? Does it matter at this point? Is it too hurt to ever come back? There's still a huge fan following of it, but are they too hurt to care about the next book? Is that ever going to be finished correctly? I mean, there's just so many questions surrounding the Kingkiller Chronicles that honestly people can talk about it forever, and that's part of the reason I think it's not going to be finished. There are 3 different approaches you can kind of look at this series. The first optimistic approach is definitely saying that there is going to be a book published at some point. He just hasn't finished it, or he has finished it and he's trying to revise it and come up with an ending that he enjoys and to give the characters that he loves so much the correct endings that he wants and to really be able to put his heart and soul into it. That's kind of the optimistic view you can kind of look at this. The middle of the road view that you can have for this is definitely more of the book isn't finished. He hasn't really touched it too much, but he is slowly working through it, and eventually the book is going to be published, or if not slowly going to be released chapter by chapter as he finally makes on his promises. And the last 2 views that I personally think that you can kind of have on this is that the book isn't going to be written or published if it is written, or if it is published that it's not going to matter. That is kind of the view that I personally have, is that it's not going to matter even if it does get published at this point. There's just been too much damage to the series as a whole, and despite people continuing to talk about it, example with this video, it's not going to last very long, and he's either going to have to publish the book that's half finished or admit that he's not going to. At this point, it really does feel like Patrick Rothfuss is just kind of dragging people along to keep them interested in the series and not giving them what he's promised. And there's that whole thing with the charity, which I understand he's not straight up pocketing the $1.3 million that was raised for it, but he didn't even give what was promised and then made kind of childlike excuses to get around it. Now, I don't have a problem with the guy, and I don't think that you should either. It's not as though he's promised a 3rd book, and so he's under no obligation to publish a 3rd book. My biggest issue, though, is the fact that he kind of has been stringing along his fans and trying to amass a bigger following and become more famous, despite not really putting in the work and having dragged his fans along for like almost 15 years, it feels like at this point. It's so hard to see people like Jay from Captured in Words talk about this series, because you just know they're huge fans of it and that they love this series so much. And from my perspective at this point, it feels like even if a 3rd book comes out, it's not going to be what all the fans want, and it's not going to end well to a point that satisfies anybody. That's even if they end up getting a 3rd book. It feels like at this point he's not writing, he has no interest in finishing the series, if he's ever even going to, and he can't probably admit it to himself. At least that's how it feels. There's a lot of things surrounding this series and the 3rd book that has honestly kind of hurt the fantasy genre as a whole, because it started off really good and people seem to enjoy the 2nd book just as much as the 1st, arguably some people not as much. That's not the point. The point is it was an enjoyed, anticipated series that people wanted the 3rd book so they could finish it and really enjoy it. And at this point, it feels like the books have been out for too long without a conclusion, that people have been picking them apart and not enjoying them as much as they did when they first read them. And the way Patrick Rothfuss has been acting around these books has honestly kind of hurt them even more, to the point to where it does feel like if the 3rd book ever does get written, it's going to be criticized so heavily, and that the series that could have been so wonderful that people really could have enjoyed for decades might just get swept under the rug and hated for eternity. And that's all assuming if he finishes it. If it never gets finished, it's always going to be assumed that he just took people's money and ran, even though that's not exactly what he did at all. That's going to be the story around it. if he doesn't finish the series. I personally haven't even read the second book, and I'm not sure that I'm even going to if there's never going to be a third. I enjoyed the first one, but the more and more I thought about it, the less and less I liked it more than other books. I think it is a good first book, looking for a better second and third to tag along with it. And the longer the first two books just sit out on the internet, the less and less people are going to like these. And the more and more he doesn't deliver on his promises, honestly, it just hurts the series as a whole, which is incredibly sad because it could have been a masterpiece that people loved for a really, really long time, but he just wasn't able to deliver it soon enough. I think it's just too far gone at this point. And to be honest, his biggest flaw in this whole thing has been the lack of communication and being honest with his fans. If you look at somebody like George R.R. Martin, while he hasn't finished his series and he is taking his time, nobody seems to be upset with him because he is constantly communicating with his fans. He has updates, people know that things are happening, and he is actively writing, and that's obvious. Not every writer, of course, can be somebody like Brandon Sanderson, constantly updating his fans, constantly replying to people, and just on top of things that much. But all people are looking for is consistent updates to know what's going on, to know that he is working on the third book, and that there is eventually going to be one. Even if he was writing something else and decided to backburner this until he knew how to finish it, and other things were being published, people would still feel better about it at that point. But it just doesn't feel like he's a writer at this point. And he's just trying to look for ways to kind of drag along his dead series in order to keep the word spread and keep talking about it. And it's just kind of sad to see. Tell me what you think. Do you think there's going to be a third book? Do you think if he publishes it's going to be any good? Do you think there's never going to be a third book? Are we ever going to get that missing chapter? Which, a note on that missing chapter, he could have essentially read anything. He could have put out a chapter saying, this probably is going to get edited out of the book, but here's a little snippet that means nothing. That's essentially a recap of book 1 and 2. That's all he really had to do. He didn't even need to give us any information about book 3 because he could have easily changed it later saying, well, this was pre-edit or something like that. There were so many options he had here with that missing chapter that I am quite honestly shocked that he didn't decide to do anything with it, and we still haven't heard anything about it in 3 years. But, I mean, that's just a whole totally different discussion at this point. So just let me know. What do you think? Do you think it's going to be published? I've seen a lot of people kind of disliking him at this point because they feel like they've been gypped and cheated. And honestly, it's hard to argue with them. I feel bad for the big fans of this series, and I wish that they get a third book at some point. And I've heard that there are plenty of fan fiction finishes out there for a third book, and some people have even said they're really good. So maybe just try writing your own fan fiction finish of this book. I don't think I'm going to pick up book 2, but if you've read book 1 and 2, let me know what you think. I kind of don't care about spoilers at this point based on everything I've already heard, but just let me know what you think about the series. Now go pick up a book.